Today, let's learn how to take effective notes when watching videos. We have 6 essential questions. Why are e-learning videos important? How are e-learning videos being used in schools? What are the 2 types of notes and why do we take notes? Then we'll get into what are the tips to take good notes from video and what are some things I should do after I take notes so they're helpful to me. Just watching videos is not enough. You need to know what to do with them. So first of all, e-learning videos are important because 46% of college students are taking at least one course online now, and by 2019 that'll be half. In business, there have been some studies that have shown how e-learning tools boost productivity. But just having the tools is not enough. How do you learn from them? We need to know how to take notes when we're watching a video. Just like if you have a lecture and you go to sleep, if you watch a video and you pay attention to everything else, you're not going to learn very much. So we need to know how to do that. So we're going to talk about how videos are being used for e-learning. And right now I'm really kind of talking about K-12, although these tips will help you in any grade level. First of all, the traditional classroom is a classroom where you have the teacher lecturing about stuff and you have the kids here taking notes, as you can see. And then at home, students will do problems if they know how, and they'll really wish that they had a little bit of help. So what happened is we ended up with something called the flipped classroom. And the teachers would record these lecture videos on video, and on their iPad or their computer, students would watch those and take notes if they knew how. And the nice thing is you could pause the video and that sort of thing. The drawback is if everybody doesn't have access, then this part doesn't happen. So you're kind of stuck with all these projects and working problems here, and students are having to watch the video, and you have some kids who have videos at home who kind of get ahead of those who don't. So that's the case where my students are, because we have a lot of students who have slow internet and we're in a rural area. So I use a system called the in-flip method. So the way that works is I create tutorial videos and such that they watch. So anything that's real specific that has notes required, we're going to usually do that with video. So I'll be on the video and they'll be watching it on their iPad or their computer, however they want to watch it. And they can pause, they can take notes. They can also do work and projects here because this is very self-paced and personalized. And then when they're at home, they can practice, they can review notes, and the nice thing is if they know how to take good notes, they can actually review parts of the video that they need. And that's one of the keys, is good note taking, is knowing how to do that. And the nice thing also about this is that it's kind of like cloning yourself. I can walk around and I can watch and help make sure this person here is understanding just by glancing over their shoulder at the notes. But then I can also help with projects and stuff. And I like this because it includes everybody, and my students who don't have as much internet access are included. So that's why we do it, and that's why we need to know how, because again, taking good notes is the key. Now, there are really 2 kinds of notes. There are notes that I call review and remember. These are things that you're going to be tested on. And in classes that have a lot of testing, this is the kind of note-taking you'll be doing. Now, my class is a lot of what we call PBL, or project-based learning. So, and my B won't type there. So that means my students are going to refer to these notes later, and that's something that they'll want to do for me. So they'll always want to be able to find those, and we'll talk about how you can find them later here at the end. So why do we take notes? It helps us pay attention to what's important. Note-taking, with a few exceptions, but for most students, note-taking helps you pay attention to what's important. When you write things that are important down, it does help trigger memories later. It also helps you understand what your teacher thinks is important and is trying to teach you so you can learn it. And I'll teach you some cues to look for so you can figure out what are those things the teacher thinks important. It's also great for review and for reference. If you put it in something like OneNote or Evernote, you can look it up later, even if you're doing handwriting. And in most cases, they're much better than the textbook. Here's why. Many teachers are not rereading the textbook along with the students, so what they say is often the most important thing. So many teachers will say, now this is important, or this is going to be on the test, and you know that is something you need to know. So in this, you'll see me briefly mention the PREPS note-taking system. This is something I wrote about in my book, Reinventing Writing. Prepare, record, engage, ponder, and sync. And you'll just see that mentioned a little bit. So our tip number one is to use the Cornell system for taking notes. At the top you have a title section. So first you draw the lines. It looks kind of like a little sideways T. Second, you will write the lesson number at the top. So I always number my videos with a little number up here at the top, and that's what you'll want to write there. Then you want to write the teacher's name or the class name, and then you'll want to write the date, and that's very important. Now you'll see at the end you could also write page numbers, and that's helpful as well. Now, good lessons typically will have essential questions at the beginning like I did for this, and what I'll do is I'll go through and I'll write these essential questions over here, and you can see this is the next thing my students are going to do is do this particular lesson on proofreaders marks, and you can kind of go ahead and write some of them on the side. Now if you see something like what are common proofreaders marks that I put here, if you don't know how long something's going to be, just stop writing those essential questions and come back to them, and you can just write the first question. But if it's an essential question, you know that your teacher thinks that's important, and you'll want to write it on the left and answer that on the right. So as I'm watching this lesson, proofreaders marks, here are my notes. Now here's some tips for the watching videos. Always put the video times, and this is how I do it on mine, so you can go back and review if you need to, particularly if you can tell it's important and you need to review it later. Second thing is anything you need to do, just write a box beside it, and I'll go back and either put them on my list. I use Wunderlist and then check them off as I put them on the list, or I'll just use this as my list and check them off as I go back and review. And then the other thing is when your teacher repeats things, underline it so you know it's important. Now I've already told you about 3 times here that listen for what's important. So you want to have a system of your own to mark what's important. Now, if the teacher starts going too fast and you miss a time, don't kill yourself to back up and get these times. These times are to be helpful. And sometimes, like this little part, I actually missed it because I was going so fast. So just get the times as much as you can. Now, if the teacher mentions or spells a name and you're not sure if you'll need it later, I'll usually just kind of put it to the side and just put it in a square or separate it out because I just don't know if it's important or not. And I mentioned Viktor Frankl in this example and wasn't sure if it was important. So the other thing is when you run out of room at the bottom of the page where you stop, don't be tempted to go into this area. This is no man's land. I'm about to show you what that's for. So a couple things is when you have a pause, it usually means it's a transition to a new idea. So I'll usually pause the video and look back at my notes and make sure I've got everything like I need to have in there. So do listen for your teacher pauses. And there's actually some research dating back to the 50s that showed that effective instructional videos had those pauses in there. So good videos will typically have some pauses. Then number 12 is write the video times on the bottom of the summary. So I can tell that this is a longer video, but this front page is 0 to 5 minutes and 15 seconds. Now, at the bottom, according to the Cornell system that we're using, we want to write a summary of what we learned on that page. And this is actually part of the review process. By looking back at this and writing a summary, we're actually reviewing and we're having to decide what is important. And when we decide what's important, that's helping us with our memory. It's helping us remember later. So this is a process for learning and recall. The other thing I like to do is if it's continued on the next page, I'll write a little arrow just so I know that there is another page there. Other thing is I usually like to leave the back of all pages blank, sometimes because it bleeds through and I can write other notes, and other times just because it's just the best thing to do. Now on the top of the next page, I'll repeat my information just in case it gets separated, and I'll always put page 2. You can go back later and say page 2 of 5 or whatever. You don't know how many pages that's going to be for now, but do number those pages. So here are some tips for good note taking. First of all, it should fit you. They should be real clear to you. Can you read the notes? Use shorthands, things like with or, for example, I use IE, and relate it to things you've already learned. I'll write in parentheses, read about this, and then I'll put a star if I need to go back and look at it later. And then also make sure that you file it properly so you can find it later. So there are a couple things that are proven to help you remember when you take notes. Anytime you use bullets or numbers, that helps you. So the process of writing 1, 2, 3 is actually a way to help you remember things. Mark things as important, and then you need to go back and review them later. There have been quite a few studies. Some show that the process of actually taking notes helps you remember. Others show that the process of taking notes is not what helps you remember. It's the process of reviewing the notes. But together, these two, we know that pretty much that we do see an improvement if we use them together. The question is which is the best, and honestly, it might be different for each student, but it is important to have that. The other thing is make sure you leave space. It's better to have more space than not enough, so you can add stuff later. A couple important things to do when you're done. When you're done taking notes, you're not truly done. You do want to take time to review your notes. One thing that I always did in college, particularly when I had tests, is to write out quiz questions for myself and answer keys. And I would make copies and go back and review later. And then sometimes I would trade those quiz questions with others just because I'm practicing kind of taking a test and I'm engaging and pondering, thinking about those things. Organize your notes. It's not necessarily to rewrite your notes to make them neater. That's not the purpose. Just organize your notes and help put them together so you can figure out what relates to your reading and other things. And then this is one of the most important, particularly for reference note taking, is file them or sync where you can review or reference later. Now, Evernote and OneNote do something called OCR. That's optical character recognition. And it basically just means it'll recognize your handwriting. And when you're writing things for reference, it's really important to be able to look them up and find them later. Because in my class, students will remember, oh, Miss Vicki taught me about proofreaders marks. Well, you can just type in proofreaders marks in your notebook and you'll find them and you can review those for later. And this is something really, really important that all of us need to do because there are a lot of classes that are useful that we will use later and you want to be able to find them. So syncing and storing is very important. Last thing, and I learned this in college, and I actually did it 2 to 3 times a week in college, and I graduated first in my class, so I do know what I'm talking about on taking notes. Is that I would take time at least once a week. If it was a really hard class, 2 to 3 times a week, I would make an appointment with myself to handle my notes. And that means to file them, to review them, to organize them. I am totally not an organized person. So my notes were always a mess and they wouldn't be in the right place. I highly suggest to high school students and middle school, you clean out your locker once a week. Make sure all your notes made it into the right place. If you're serious about being a good student, you'll do that. Finally, we've talked about 20 tips for effective note taking when watching videos. I hope you'll put these into practice. Good luck.